Harper Reynolds didn't have time for distractions, least of all a new intern shadowing her on the most important week of the year. She barely glanced up when the elevator doors slid open, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisp white shirt and dark slacks. "You must be the new intern," she said without looking up from her tablet. "Grab a notepad. I move fast and I don't like repeating myself." The man hesitated for half a second before stepping forward. "New intern?" He sounded amused, but Harper didn't have time for whatever awkwardness was happening. "Yes, new intern," she said, finally looking at him. She blinked. He was not what she expected. Most interns showed up looking nervous, eager to please. This man looked like he owned the room. His dark hair was neatly styled, his jawline sharp enough to cut glass, and his piercing blue eyes studied her with quiet intensity. He started, but Harper was already moving. "We have a meeting in 5 minutes. I need the latest investor reports, and if you don't know where to find them, figure it out." She strode down the hall, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The man exhaled a short laugh but followed her, matching her pace effortlessly. "Investor reports." "Got it." Harper pushed through the glass doors of the conference room, expecting him to take a seat at the back and observe. Instead, he eased into the chair at the head of the table, her boss's chair. She frowned. "What are you doing?" The senior executives filed in, their conversations trailing off as they noticed the man sitting comfortably at the head of the table. Harper tightened her grip on her tablet. Something was off. Then her boss, Richard Calloway, entered, his expression shifting from confusion to panic. "Mr. Carter," he blurted. "We weren't expecting you until later this week." Harper's stomach dropped. "Mr. Carter, as in James Carter, the billionaire investor? Oh no." James Carter leaned back in the chair, his gaze flicking to Harper with unmistakable amusement. "I got an early start," he said smoothly. "And it seems I've already been given a new role," his lips quirked. "Intern." The room was dead silent. Harper's face burned. James turned his attention back to Richard. "I assume we're ready to begin," Richard nodded quickly. "Of course. Harper, why don't you start?" Harper swallowed hard, forcing herself to regain composure. She had just ordered James Carter to grab a notepad, and now she had to present to him. Fantastic. She took a steadying breath and launched into the presentation, willing herself to forget the way James Carter was watching her, his expression unreadable. But every time she glanced his way, that knowing glint in his eyes told her one thing: he was enjoying this way too much. Harper kept her voice steady as she outlined the key points of the proposal, moving through the figures and projections with the precision of a seasoned professional. But no matter how focused she tried to be, she could feel James Carter's gaze on her, cool and assessing. She refused to let it rattle her. "The expansion into the European market is already showing promising early returns," she continued, clicking to the next slide. "However, to maintain momentum, we need to—" James shifted in his seat, the sound somehow louder than it should have been in the otherwise silent room. Harper flicked her eyes toward him. He wasn't even looking at the screen, he was watching her. The corner of his mouth lifted just slightly, a slow, deliberate smirk. Her breath hitched a barely perceptible pause, but she powered through, refusing to let him see that he'd unsettled her. She finished the presentation, clicked off the projector, and met the room's expectant silence with confidence. "That concludes my report. Are there any questions?" A few murmurs of approval rippled through the executives, but James remained silent, fingers steepled against his chin as he studied her. Richard Calloway cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, do you have any thoughts?" The billionaire investor didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the silence stretch, as if he were testing how long Harper could hold his gaze without faltering. Then, finally, he spoke. Well, he said, his voice smooth with amusement, I must say I'm impressed. Harper didn't let herself react. She merely gave a polite nod. Thank you. But, he continued, his tone shifting just slightly, I do have a question. She braced herself. Of course. James leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. Tell me, Harper, he said, drawing out her name in a way that sent a flicker of something dangerous up her spine. If you were in my position, would you approve this expansion? The room went completely still. Richard's expression tightened. A few executives shifted uncomfortably. Everyone knew this was a test. Harper wasn't supposed to be in James Carter's position. She was supposed to present the data, not make the decision. But James had just put her on the spot, and he was watching her with keen interest, waiting. Harper's pulse pounded in her ears, but she didn't let it show. She held his gaze, refusing to shrink beneath the weight of his challenge. Yes, she said, her voice firm. I would. A hushed murmur spread through the room. James raised an eyebrow, confident answer. I don't deal in uncertainty, she replied. The numbers speak for themselves. The European market is responding well to our product, and the projections indicate sustainable growth. With the right strategic adjustments, there's no reason not to move forward. James tapped a finger against the table, considering. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he gave a slow nod. Interesting, he mused. I like a woman who knows what she wants. A few of the senior executives exchanged wary glances. Richard let out a nervous chuckle. Harper, however, refused to take the bait. This isn't about what I want, she said smoothly. It's about what's best for the company. James's smirk deepened, like he'd expected that answer. Of course, he murmured. Then just like that he stood, straightening his sleeves with effortless grace. Well, he said, glancing around the room. I believe I have all the information I need for now. Richard practically scrambled to his feet. Excellent. We'll have the finalized reports on your desk by the end of the day. James nodded absently, but his attention was still on Harper. She refused to look away first. Finally, he turned toward the door. But as he passed by her, he leaned in just slightly, voice low enough that only she could hear. We'll be seeing more of each other, Harper. And then he was gone. The room released a collective breath. Harper, however, remained completely still, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had no idea what James Carter had meant by that, but something told her she was about to find out. Harper barely made it back to her desk before the whispers started. Did you see how he looked at her? He's never sat in on a meeting like that before. She spoke to him like he was just another employee. Does she even know who he is? She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to ignore the murmurs. She had work to do. The last thing she needed was to dwell on James Carter and whatever game he was playing. She tapped at her keyboard, pulling up the latest reports, but her focus was shot. Every time she tried to concentrate, her mind wandered back to the way James had leaned in, the slight smirk on his lips. The heat behind his words, "We'll be seeing more of each other, Harper." What did that mean? A shadow fell over her desk. Harper. She looked up to see Richard standing there, his expression tight. Come with me, he said. Now, she didn't ask questions. She grabbed her tablet and followed him down the hall, past the rows of desks where employees pretended not to watch, and into his office. The door shut behind them with a sharp click. Richard turned to face her, arms crossed. What the hell was that? Harper arched a brow. What was what? You, challenging James Carter in front of the entire board, she straightened. I answered his question. Richard's nostrils flared. You don't answer James Carter, you don't challenge him. You nod, you smile, and you let him do whatever the hell he wants. Harper folded her arms. If he didn't want an answer, he wouldn't have asked. Richard exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his graying hair. Harper, listen to me. James Carter isn't just another investor. He owns more of this company than anyone else. If he doesn't like you, you're done. And after the way you spoke to him, He shook his head. I wouldn't be surprised if he's already planning to have you replaced. A flicker of unease crept up her spine, but she pushed it away. If he's that thin-skinned, then he's not the businessman everyone claims he is. Richard looked at her like she'd lost her mind. For your sake, I hope you're right. Before she could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then back at her. Go, I need to handle this. Harper didn't argue. She stepped out of the office, closing the door behind her. The second she turned, she nearly collided with a solid chest. She looked up and her breath caught. James Carter. Standing right in front of her, hands in his pockets, watching her with that same unreadable expression from the meeting. Going somewhere? He asked. Harper hesitated, then lifted her chin. Back to my desk. He considered that, then took a step closer. Take a walk with me. It wasn't a request. Harper's pulse quickened. Every instinct told her to refuse to keep her distance. But she knew that wasn't an option, not when James Carter had just set his sights on her. She nodded once. Fine. He led her down the hall, past the sea of curious eyes and into an empty conference room. The door shut with a quiet click. For a moment he said nothing, just watched her. Then finally, you're not afraid of me. It wasn't a question. Harper crossed her arms. Should I be? His lips curved slightly. Most people are. Well, I'm not most people. His gaze darkened just slightly. No, he murmured. You're not. She ignored the way her stomach flipped at the way he said that. What do you want, Mr. Carter? James, he corrected. And I wanted to see how you'd react. She frowned. To what? To me. Harper stiffened. I don't play games, James. He chuckled, low and rich. Everyone plays games, Harper. Some just don't realize it. She clenched her jaw. If you called me in here to intimidate me, you're wasting your time. His amusement deepened. Intimidate you? He stepped closer, and suddenly the air felt heavier. No, Harper. I don't want to intimidate you. Her breath hitched as he studied her, his eyes trailing over her face like he was memorizing every detail. I want to figure you out. Harper swallowed. There's nothing to figure out. I don't believe that. Silence stretched between them, thick with something she couldn't name. Then, just as quickly as he'd closed the distance, he stepped back. For now, I'll let you get back to work, he said. But we'll be having this conversation again. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. If that's all, I have reports to finalize. His lips twitched. For now. And then, just like before, he was gone. Harper stood there for a long moment, heart hammering. James Carter wasn't done with her. And no matter how much she told herself, she didn't care. A small, treacherous part of her wasn't sure she wanted him to be. Harper barely made it back to her desk before the weight of what had just happened settled over her. Her fingers hovered over her keyboard, but she wasn't typing. She wasn't even thinking about work anymore. Instead, her mind was caught in a loop, replaying every word, every glance, every deliberate step James Carter had taken toward her. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. No, she wasn't going to let this distract her. But then, as if the universe wanted to test her resolve, her phone rang. Harper Reynolds, Miss Reynolds. The voice on the other end was smooth, composed, familiar. Her grip tightened on the phone. Mr. Carter. A soft chuckle. James, he corrected. She closed her eyes briefly, inhaling through her nose. How did you get my number? I own the company. It wasn't difficult. She should have expected that. What do you want? I have a dinner reservation at Bellamy's tonight, he said casually. Join me. Harper blinked. Excuse me? You heard me. Her pulse jumped. Bellamy's was one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. A place where deals were made, where billionaires dined behind velvet ropes, where reservations were booked months in advance. And James Carter was inviting her. She straightened in her chair. If this is some kind of test, it's not a test, he interrupted smoothly. Just dinner. Everything inside her told her to say no, to tell him she wasn't interested in whatever game he was playing. But instead she found herself saying, "Fine." "Good," James said, satisfaction evident in his tone. "I'll send a car for you at 7. Before she could protest, the line went dead. Harper stared at her phone. What the hell had she just agreed to? At precisely 7 o'clock, a sleek black town car pulled up outside her apartment. Harper hesitated only a moment before stepping inside, smoothing her hands over the emerald green dress she'd chosen, professional but elegant. Not that she cared what James thought. The drive was silent, save for the quiet hum of the engine. When they arrived at Bellamy's, a valet opened her door and she stepped onto the polished pavement, heart hammering. Inside, the restaurant was dimly lit, glowing with the soft flicker of candlelight reflecting off crystal glasses. James was already seated at a private table near the back, watching her with an unreadable expression. "You came," he said, standing as she approached. "You didn't leave me much of a choice," she replied, taking the seat across from him. He smirked. "I find that people always have a choice. They just don't always admit why they make it." She ignored the implication. A waiter appeared, pouring them each a glass of wine before slipping away. Harper took a careful sip, composing herself. "So," she said, meeting his gaze, "are we here to talk about business or something else?" James tilted his head slightly. "Why do you assume it has to be one or the other?" "Because I don't mix the two," she said simply. He studied her for a moment. "You don't trust me." She set her glass down. "Should I?" Something flickered in his eyes, something sharp, assessing. "Trust is earned, Harper." "Then why am I here?" James leaned back, fingers tapping against the stem of his glass. "Because you intrigue me." Her stomach tightened. "I'm not here to entertain you, Mr. Carter." "James," he corrected again, his voice lower this time. She exhaled, forcing herself to stay composed. "If this is about what happened in the meeting, it's not," he said, cutting her off. "At least, not entirely." She frowned. "Then what is it?" James watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he said, "You're different from the people I usually deal with." She arched a brow. "Because I don't bow to you," he smirked. Something like that. Silence stretched between them. Harper wasn't sure what game he was playing, but she wasn't going to fall for it. She picked up her fork, cutting into the perfectly seared fillet in front of her. "If this is just your way of testing me, you're wasting your time." James chuckled, shaking his head. "You're not a test, Harper." "Then what am I?" He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to something almost intimate. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Her breath caught, but she refused to let him see that he'd unsettled her. Instead, she set down her fork, meeting his gaze head-on. "And what if I don't want to be figured out?" James studied her, his expression thoughtful. Then, after a moment, he said, "Then I suppose I'll just have to be patient." Something about the way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. Because for the first time since meeting James Carter, Harper had the distinct feeling that patience was something he had in abundance. And that, no matter how much she tried to resist it. He wasn't planning on walking away anytime soon. Harper expected the dinner to be a one-time event, a strange, unexpected evening that she could file away as nothing more than an odd encounter with a billionaire who was used to getting his way. But James Carter wasn't the type to let things go. The very next morning, as she walked into the office with a fresh coffee in hand, she spotted him standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive wing, speaking with Richard Calloway. Unlike the first time she'd seen him, there was no mistaking his presence now. He wasn't an intern, wasn't someone shadowing for experience. He was the most powerful man in the building, and if the way executives hovered nervously near him was any indication, they all knew he could make or break them with a single word. Harper tightened her grip on her coffee, willing herself to ignore him. She had a full day ahead: meetings, reports, and an upcoming investor presentation that required her complete focus. She made it halfway to her desk before a familiar, smooth voice stopped her. "Harper," she turned, already bracing herself. James was watching her with that same unreadable expression, hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored suit. "Walk with me," he said. Her pulse kicked up, but she kept her face neutral. "I have work to do." His lips twitched. "Consider this part of it." She hesitated, then sighed. If she refused, he'd just find another way to pull her into whatever game he was playing. And the last thing she needed was more office gossip about why James Carter was so interested in her. Without another word, she followed him down the hall. They stepped into a private lounge area, a space reserved for top executives. It was quiet, with plush leather seating and a view of the city skyline stretching beyond the glass walls. James turned to face her. "You're avoiding me." Harper crossed her arms. "I'm working." "You can do both," she exhaled sharply. "What do you want, James?" He studied her for a moment, then said, "I want to know why you're fighting this so hard." She frowned. "Fighting what?" "Me." A slow, simmering frustration built in her chest. "Because I don't have time for distractions." His gaze flickered with something unreadable. "And you think that's what I am, a distraction?" She held his stare. "Yes." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them thickened, charged with something she didn't want to name. Then James took a slow step closer. "I don't believe you." Harper refused to back down. "That's not my problem." A soft chuckle escaped him, but there was something else in his expression, something sharper, more intrigued than amused. "Tell me, Harper," he said, voice low. "When was the last time you did something just because you wanted to?" She blinked. "What?" He tilted his head slightly, watching her like he was unraveling a puzzle. "You're always in control, always composed, but I don't think you allow yourself many moments of indulgence." Her jaw tightened. "And you think you know me well enough to say that?" He didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer but no less certain. "I think you don't let yourself have what you want because you're afraid of what it might cost you." A strange, unwelcome heat curled in her chest. She hated that he saw so much. And she hated that a small, treacherous part of her wondered if he was right. Harper steadied herself, inhaling deeply. "This conversation is over." She turned to leave, but before she could take a step, James said, "Dinner. Tonight." She stopped. He wasn't asking. She exhaled, willing herself to stay firm. "I already gave you one dinner." "Give me another." Her pulse pounded in her ears. She should say no, she needed to say no, but instead she found herself saying, "Fine." James smiled, slow, knowing. "Good." And just like that, she knew she was in trouble. Harper wasn't sure why she agreed to another dinner. Maybe it was exhaustion. She was tired of the tension, the way James Carter always seemed to be one step ahead of her. Or maybe, and she hated admitting this even to herself, it was curiosity. She told herself she wasn't dressing up for him. The midnight blue dress she slipped into was practical, classic. The soft waves in her hair were simply because she had the time. And the faint touch of perfume at her wrists, routine. But when she stepped into the private dining space James had reserved, a luxurious rooftop restaurant overlooking the city, she felt his gaze sweep over her like a slow caress, and she knew she was lying to herself. James stood as she approached, ever the gentleman, but the glint in his eyes was unmistakable. "You look stunning," he said, his voice smooth, effortless. Harper pulled out her own chair before he could do it for her, ignoring the way his lips twitched in amusement. "Let's skip the flattery and get to the reason you invited me here." James took his seat across from her, fingers tapping idly against the stem of his glass. "Do I need a reason? You don't strike me as the kind of man who does anything without one." He smirked but didn't deny it. Instead, he lifted his glass, swirling the deep red wine before taking a slow sip. "Tell me something, Harper." She braced herself. "What?" "Have you ever considered what you'd be doing if you weren't here?" She frowned. "Here as in this restaurant." No, he said, watching her carefully. Here in this life, this job. This path you've chosen. Harper hesitated, caught off guard. No one had ever asked her that before. She glanced down at the table, at the flickering candlelight reflecting off the pristine white tablecloth. She could still remember the long nights she spent studying, the pressure of proving herself in a world that underestimated women like her. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to entertain the idea of anything else. This is what I've always wanted, she said finally. James leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table. That's not what I asked, she exhaled, resisting the urge to shift in her seat. I don't waste time on hypotheticals. This job, this life, it's not something I stumbled into, I built it. His gaze didn't waver. And yet you hesitate when I ask. Harper clenched her jaw, because it's a pointless question. James studied her for a long moment, then leaned back, his expression unreadable. I don't think it is. Frustration curled in her chest. Why does it matter to you? Because I think there's more to you than what you let people see, he said simply. Her breath caught, but before she could respond, the waiter arrived with their first course. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, the weight of his words lingering between them. By the time the meal ended, Harper was more unsettled than she had been when she arrived. James walked her to the car he had arranged for her, his presence steady at her side. As she reached for the door handle, he spoke again. You don't have to keep proving yourself, Harper. She turned, startled. What? You've already won, he said, his voice softer now. Maybe it's time you let yourself enjoy it. Harper swallowed, her fingers tightening around the car door. She didn't know how to answer that, so she didn't. She slipped inside, closing the door between them, but as the car pulled away, her reflection in the window showed the truth. James Carter had gotten under her skin, and no matter how much she wanted to fight it, she wasn't sure she wanted him to stop. The days that followed were a constant battle between Harper's carefully built walls and the undeniable presence of James Carter in her life. She told herself she was imagining it, that the way he always seemed to be near, the way his gaze lingered just a little too long, was coincidence. But deep down, she knew better. James wasn't the kind of man who did anything by accident. She tried to keep her distance, throwing herself into work with renewed focus. But it became increasingly difficult when James made it clear he wasn't going anywhere. He didn't demand her time outright. Instead, he wove himself into her routine in ways she couldn't ignore. A casual remark in the hallway that turned into a conversation she hadn't meant to have. A passing glance in a meeting that sent her pulse skittering. Even a simple moment in the break room when she reached for the coffee pot only to find him already there, pouring a second cup and handing it to her without a word. She hated the way her fingers tingled when they brushed against his. She hated even more that he noticed. One evening, long after most of the office had emptied out, Harper was still at her desk, reviewing the final details for a major investor summit happening the next day. She barely registered the sound of footsteps approaching until a familiar voice broke the silence. You work too late. She looked up, heart tightening despite herself. James stood in the doorway, his jacket slung over one shoulder, watching her with quiet amusement. She exhaled, setting her pen down. Someone has to. He took that as an invitation, stepping inside and leaning against the edge of her desk. Let me guess, you haven't eaten, she hesitated. His smirk was infuriating. I'll take that as a yes. I don't have time for dinner, she said, turning back to her screen. James didn't move. So you plan to sit here all night, running on caffeine and sheer stubbornness? She didn't answer. He sighed then, before she could stop him, plucked the pen from her fingers and set it aside. Come on, she frowned. What are you doing? Taking you to dinner. I told you I don't have time, Harper, he said, and something in his voice made her pause. You have to eat, she clenched her jaw. I don't need you to take care of me, his gaze darkened. I know you don't. But that doesn't mean I don't want to. A strange, unwanted warmth curled in her stomach. She should have pushed back, should have told him to leave. But instead, she found herself standing, grabbing her coat and following him out of the office. The restaurant was quieter than she expected. Not the high-profile, extravagant kind of place James usually favored, but something smaller, more intimate. A tucked-away bistro with warm lighting and the rich scent of freshly baked bread in the air. Harper eyed him suspiciously as they settled into a booth near the back. "This doesn't seem like your usual scene." James smirked, signaling the waiter. "You assume a lot about me." She arched a brow. "Am I wrong?" Instead of answering, he ordered for both of them something simple, classic. Harper should have bristled at the assumption, but she was too tired to argue. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the day settling between them. Then James spoke. "Why do you fight so hard?" She frowned. "Fight what?" "This, everything," he gestured slightly. "You work twice as hard as anyone else in that office. You push yourself beyond reason. Why?" Harper stiffened. "Because I have to." His gaze didn't waver. "Says who?" She exhaled sharply. "Says the world. Says every person who's ever looked at me and assumed I wasn't good enough, wasn't strong enough. I've had to prove myself every step of the way, James. I don't get to coast on reputation or connections. If I don't fight, I lose." Something flickered in his expression. For the first time, she saw something beyond the confidence, the amusement. "A quiet understanding. Is that how you see me?" he asked. She hesitated. "What? You think I've never had to fight for anything?" Harper scoffed. "You're James Carter, billionaire, investor. You walk into a room and people fall over themselves to impress you. What could you possibly know about struggling?" His jaw tightened. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then finally, he leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "You think power comes easy, that respect is handed out freely." She frowned. "It wasn't always this way," he said quietly. "I built what I have, I fought for it. And I learned early that when you have money, people assume it defines you." She swallowed. He wasn't smiling anymore. "You're right," he admitted. "I don't have to prove myself the way you do, but that doesn't mean I don't understand what it's like to be underestimated." Harper looked away, suddenly uncomfortable. The food arrived, breaking the tension, but the conversation lingered in the air between them. She wasn't sure what to do with this version of James, the man who wasn't just charm and confidence, but something else. Something real. And that terrified her more than anything. By the time they left, the city was quiet, the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. James walked her to the car, his presence steady beside her. She hesitated before getting in, turning to face him. "Why are you doing this?" He studied her, something unreadable in his expression. Then, after a long moment, he said, "Because I see you, Harper." Her breath caught. Before she could respond, he stepped back, nodding toward the waiting car. "Get some rest," he said. And then he was gone. Harper sat in the back seat, staring out the window as the city blurred past. She had spent so long building walls, keeping people at a distance. But James Carter wasn't just knocking at the door. He was walking straight through it. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure she wanted to stop him. Harper wasn't sure when it had happened. When the battle between her and James Carter had shifted into something else, something deeper, something undeniable. She had spent so much time resisting him, convincing herself he was a distraction she didn't need, that she hadn't realized the truth creeping in beneath her defenses. She wanted him. It wasn't just about the way he looked at her, with that quiet, knowing intensity that made her stomach tighten. It wasn't just the way his presence filled a room, commanding attention without effort. It was the way he saw her, really saw her, in a way no one else ever had. And that terrified her. But it was too late to run now. James had slipped into her life like a force of nature, and no matter how much she had pushed back, he had never wavered. He had never demanded, never forced, but he had never let her hide either. And somehow, despite every wall she had built, he had gotten inside. Now, as she sat across from him in the back of his car, the city lights streaking past the tinted windows, she could feel the shift between them. It was in the way he sat closer than necessary, the way his arm rested along the back of the seat, his fingers barely grazing her shoulder. It was in the way neither of them spoke, the silence charged, unspoken words hanging between them. She turned slightly, meeting his gaze. His eyes flickered with something unreadable, something deep and unguarded. For once, she didn't overthink. She just let herself feel. The car slowed to a stop in front of her building, but neither of them moved. James reached out, his fingers tracing a slow, deliberate path along the back of her hand. Her breath hitched. "You're thinking too much," he murmured. She swallowed, her pulse thrumming. "I don't know how to stop." James studied her for a long moment, then shifted, closing the small distance between them. His lips were close, so close she could feel the warmth of his breath against her skin. "Then let me help you," he said, and then, finally, he kissed her. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't demanding. It was slow, deliberate, as if he was savoring every second. His hand slid up, cupping her jaw, tilting her face toward him, and Harper melted. She had spent so long fighting him. But now, in his arms, she couldn't remember why. When they finally pulled apart, her breath was unsteady, her heart racing. James rested his forehead against hers, his voice low. "Tell me to stop, and I will." But she didn't. Because for the first time in a long time, she didn't want to. Harper had always believed in control, in clear lines and firm boundaries. But as she stood in her apartment later that night, staring at her own reflection in the dimly lit bathroom mirror, she couldn't ignore the truth. James Carter had shattered every one of her carefully built defenses, and worse, she had let him. Her fingers brushed against her lips, still tingling from his kiss. A kiss she had returned without hesitation, without thought. She had spent weeks convincing herself that he was nothing more than a distraction, that his presence in her life was temporary. But the way he looked at her, the way he touched her, there was nothing temporary about it. A soft knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. Her heart stuttered. She knew who it was before she even reached for the handle. James stood on the other side, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, they burned with something unmistakable. "I should have left," he murmured, stepping inside. Harper swallowed, her breath shallow. "But you didn't." "No," he admitted, closing the door behind him. "I didn't." Silence stretched between them, thick with everything unspoken. The air felt charged, their connection a live wire between them. James reached for her, his fingers brushing against her wrist, and Harper felt her resolve unraveling all over again. "This isn't just a game to me, Harper." His voice was low, steady, but filled with something deeper, something that made her chest tighten. "It never was." She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "You always get what you want, don't you?" His lips curved slightly, but there was no arrogance in it, only certainty. "Not always." His fingers traced slow, deliberate lines along her arm. "But I know what I want now." She should have been scared. She should have put distance between them, reminded him and herself that they came from different worlds, that this was dangerous. But she didn't. Because for the first time in her life she wanted to lose control, so she let herself fall. James caught her effortlessly, his arms wrapping around her as his lips found hers again. This time, the kiss wasn't careful. It wasn't restrained. It was deep, consuming, the kind of kiss that left no room for doubt, no space for hesitation. He lifted her easily, carrying her toward the couch, and Harper didn't stop him. She didn't think. She just felt. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of wanting something she couldn't control. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting warm, golden hues across the room. Harper stirred, the weight of reality settling over her as she slowly opened her eyes. James, he was still here. He stood near the window, already dressed, his broad shoulders framed by the morning light. His hands were tucked into his pockets, his posture relaxed, but she could see the tension in his jaw. He was waiting for her to say something. She sat up, pulling the sheet around her, studying him. "You're not running." He turned, his lips quirking slightly. "Neither are you," she exhaled, shaking her head. "I don't know what this is." James walked toward her, crouching down so they were eye level. "It's real." His fingers brushed against her knee. "And I'm not going anywhere, Harper." Her throat tightened. "It's not that simple." His expression softened. "It can be." She wanted to believe him. But the part of her that had spent years fighting for everything she had, the part of her that feared vulnerability, whispered doubts in the back of her mind. James cupped her face gently, tilting her chin so she had no choice but to look at him. "You don't have to prove anything to me," he murmured. "I already know how incredible you are." Her chest ached. She had spent her whole life proving herself. But James, he didn't ask her to, he just saw her. And with that realization, something inside her cracked open. She leaned into his touch, exhaling slowly. "I don't want to fight this anymore," James smiled, brushing a soft kiss against her forehead. "Then don't." And for once, Harper let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to. Harper had spent years chasing success, believing that love was a complication she couldn't afford. But as she stood in the quiet of her apartment, wrapped in James's arms, she realized something startling. She had never truly let herself want anything before. Not like this, not like him. James had given her space to run, but he'd never let her go too far. He had seen her fears, her walls, and instead of breaking them down, he had waited for her to open the door herself. And she had. The days that followed were a whirlwind of stolen moments and whispered promises. James didn't demand anything, but he was always there, steady, unwavering. He fit into her life in a way she hadn't expected, showing up with coffee when she didn't ask, pulling her into a slow kiss at the end of a long day, reminding her, in the quietest ways, that she wasn't alone anymore. And the craziest part, she didn't want to be. She had spent so long believing that allowing herself to love someone meant losing herself. But with James, it wasn't like that. He didn't ask her to change. He didn't ask her to be anything other than exactly who she was. And for the first time, Harper wanted to see what it felt like to not just succeed, but to be happy. That realization settled deep in her bones as she walked into the office one morning, feeling lighter than she had in years. The usual chaos of the workday unfolded around her, but it no longer felt like a weight pressing her down. Instead, it felt like something she was choosing, rather than something she was chained to. She had built this life, and now, for the first time, she was allowing herself to truly live in it. James had been right all along. She had already won. That evening, Harper found herself outside James's penthouse, her heart pounding as she knocked on the door. It opened within moments, and there he was, shirt sleeves rolled up, top button undone, looking at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. "Harper," he murmured, stepping aside. She walked in, but instead of the usual push and pull, the careful dance they had been doing for weeks, she turned to face him, meeting his gaze head-on. "I love you," James stilled. For the first time, Harper saw something flicker in his expression, something raw, something unguarded. Then, in a single step, he was in front of her, his hands cupping her face as he kissed her like it was the only thing that had ever made sense. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against hers, his voice low, reverent. "I love you too." A quiet laugh bubbled up in Harper's chest, a mix of relief and disbelief. "I fought this so hard." James smirked, brushing his thumb along her jaw. "I know, but you were always going to end up here," she exhaled, leaning into him. "Yeah. I think I was." He kissed her again, slow and deep, as if sealing the truth between them, and in that moment Harper knew there was no more running. This was real. This was forever. and she had never wanted anything more.